Yo, what's good E7 fam? Pat here, back with another how to play video, and in this one we'll be talking about an ML 5-star who has previously struggled to really find their footing in this game, and that is going to be DaiJouBu Basar. As with all of my how to play videos, I'll be going super in depth and trying to cover almost everything you could want to know about the character, including things like stats, skills, possible in-game equipment builds for you to try out, as well as some PvP knowledge if that's your thing. But before we jump in and actually talk about DJ Basar's stats, if you're new here, please consider liking the video, commenting, or subscribing. Really helps out a ton here, and I would really appreciate it. With that out of the way, let's move on to the stats. DaiJouBu Basar is a light soul weaver of the Sagittarius zodiac symbol. He shares a stat line with Tamarin. Taking a look at his stats, he has 957 attack, 4,370 health, 111 speed, 652 defense, 15% critical hit chance, 150% critical hit damage, 5% dual attack chance, 12% effectiveness, and 18% starting effect resistance. This stat line honestly is a mess, and I think it's one of the worst ones that a 5-star can actually have in Epic 7. 957 attack is, I believe, the highest among Soul Weavers in the game, but still very low when compared to other 5-stars in Epic 7. So even though it's very high, it doesn't really account for a whole heck of a lot. 4,370 health is actually terrible for a Soul Weaver. It's so bad that having a flat health ring or necklace is almost as good as having a health percentage ring or necklace. And that's after this has been buffed. In the past, it was just strictly better to play flat health. If you play a percentage ring or necklace on this actual character, you will get a whopping 5 extra HP as opposed to wearing a flat ring or necklace. So when we get to the character build section, it's pretty much going to be indistinguishable whether or not you use flat health or health percentage because it's just that bad on the character. 111 speed is very fast though for a Soul Weaver. It is slightly above average, and it is the second fastest zodiac symbol for Soul Weavers. Taurus, which is Ray and Bunny Dominiel, who you may have seen running around a lot of streams recently, are going to be the fastest zodiac signs. The defense at 652 is very good compared to a lot of other 5-stars in the game, but is still pretty low for a Soul Weaver. You also get some, mixed bag of goodies here with the effectiveness and effect resistance, which are useful, and we'll talk about why in the very next section when we talk about the skills. As a bit of trivia before we actually go on to talk about those skills, let's talk about the English and Japanese voiceover artist for Basar as well as DaiJouBu Basar. In the English dub of Epic 7, Basar is voiced by one of the very best in the industry today, and that is Matthew Mercer. He is in an absolute slew of stuff. You can hear him as Levi in Attack on Titan, the redacted cowboy Cassidy in Overwatch. You can hear him as Chrom in Fire Emblem, Yusuke in Persona 5, and you can also hear him as Mr. Yade Yade Daze himself, Jotaro from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. In the Japanese dub of Epic 7, however, Basar is voiced by Tomokazu Sugita, who you can hear as Escanor in The Seven Deadly Sins, Kyon in one of my favorite anime, The Melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, Chrom from Fire Emblem, Yusuke from Persona 5, and Joseph Joestar from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So if you've been keeping track, yes, Basar is technically in both English and Japanese the voice of Chrom, the voice of Yusuke, and is also a JoBro. Nice!
Will I do anything for you, darling?
DaiJouBu Basar's S1 is Desert Wind. It has a 1.2x attack multiplier. It has a 25 to 35% chance, depending on mologora, to stun the target for 1 turn. Additionally, it heals all allies. That heal is equal to 7.2% of the target's max health, as well as 18% of DaiJouBu Basar's attack. Realistically, this is going to heal anywhere between roughly 830 to 2600 or so HP, depending on how tanky each of the units on your team are. That's actually pretty good when you consider it, because if you remember, Ruel is roughly around 7% of the target's max health on her S1, and this is an AoE heal, so you're going to get a bit more out of it than you would expect from other Soul Weavers. It's really good when you think about it. Just good damage multiplier. It has a stun even if it's 5% lower than some of the other S1 stuns that we have on similar units like Maid Chloe. And again, it has a heal for the entire team, and that heal is pretty much, again, equal to what you would expect from Ruel giving on a single target.
Sometimes even I'm amazed by my own talent.
I think if there is a drawback on Desert Wind, it's that it's attached to DaiJouBu Basar, because again, his health is really, really bad. His survivability is just really, really abysmal compared to other Soul Weavers in this game. So you're not going to get to leverage Desert Wind too often or for very prolonged fights, because he's probably going to be the character that's focus fired first and foremost. DaiJouBu Basar's S2 is his, I guess now, signature skill after his most recent round of changes, and that is Desert Storm. It is a non-attack skill, and you acquire 2 souls upon use, and it has a 4 to 5 turn cooldown. It inflicts Barrier Inversion on all enemies and has a 60 to 75% chance, depending on mologora, to blind all enemies for 2 turns. When the target is granted a barrier, grants an extra turn to the caster. There's a fancy way of saying if the Barrier Inversion mechanic is successful when using this move, you will get an extra turn. How Barrier Inversion works is it inverts a barrier into damage per the in-game tooltip. So if your opponents have a 4,000 HP barrier and you use Desert Storm, it will remove the barrier and they'll deal 4,000 damage to them. So for example, a character like Peyra, who has an absolutely massive shield that she gets when she uses her S3, it sometimes might be bigger than her entire health bar. In that case, if you were to hit her with Desert Storm, it would invert the barrier and basically kill her in one hit and grant you an extra turn. That is primarily what DaiJouBu Basar is used for, at least in the current metagame as of the recording of this video. He is another way to punish barrier characters like the recent Fallen Cecilia that we just did a guide on. So you should just know, first and foremost, if your opponent is packing barrier characters like Hua Young, Fallen Cecilia, or somebody like Peyra, DaiJouBu Basar gains an immense amount of value just because of this Barrier Inversion mechanic. The blind is also nice as well, but it is important to note Desert Storm is a non-attack skill. That means that it can be countered and punished by characters such as Politis, Celine, and also a character like Teu should he ever get buffs and become meta relevant at some point.
I'll show you how it's done. What'll happen now?
DaiJouBu Basar's S3 is Bastet Roar. You acquire 2 souls upon use and has a 4 to 5 turn cooldown depending on mologora. It is a non-attack skill that dispels all debuffs from all allies and grants them immunity for 2 turns. After that, it will increase their combat readiness by 20 to 30% depending on mologora. While Bastet Roar is available and not on cooldown, DaiJouBu Basar will have critical hits do 30% less damage to him, and that obviously does not stack with other damage reduction effects.
The power of the desert is with us. Going out with friends is quite fun, actually.
I used to meme on Bastet Roar a lot when I didn't have the unit and back in the day when DaiJouBu Basar wasn't as good. But now that I have him, I realize this is a pretty good S3 because it's very versatile in what it actually does. First off, it is a full cleanse, and not a lot of cleansers nowadays are full cleanses. You have characters like your designer Lilibets who have essentially, turn reduction on debuffs, and they don't really get rid of everything under the sun. They don't get rid of bombs, for example. So if you are looking for a cleanser, somebody that can get rid of everything, DaiJouBu Basar will absolutely have you covered. And he has base effect resistance in his kit, which means it is very, very easy for him to get a bit higher on the actual values, especially when you consider things like imprints in the character. So that is already pretty good. It's not great because of characters like Mediator Koeric, but Mediator Koeric honestly kind of breaks the game when it comes to how cleanses are treated in this game. Immunity, 2 turns, pretty good also on this move. We talk about that a lot in some of my other videos. 1 turn immunity, pretty easy to blow through, but if you have a bunch of stacked buffs on your team, and especially if it's like a 2 or a 3 turn immunity, it's a lot harder for most of the strippers nowadays to actually get through, because they only get rid of like 1 to 2 debuffs, and they only really get rid of like 1 to 2 turns on a lot of things. So there are times where the immunity actually is relevant. For example, if you're playing against Politis and you use Bastet Roar, you don't really have to fear the S3 unbuffable and blind from Politis. You only really need to worry about the actual incoming damage from things like her S2 Astral Glide, and again, the AoE from her S3. The immunity will protect you from all of the Abyssal Crown stuns, all of the nonsense, again, that comes from the S3. So that's really, really good. The most interesting part about this move is definitely the combat readiness, though. You can, depending on artifact choice, use her as a character very similar and akin to Designer Lilibet, where she punishes specific openers if they actually debuff your team. You can use it in such a way that if you build him very, very fast, like say 280, 290 speed, like we had when we had the plus 15 Soul Weaver speed buff in the most recent meta, then you can also use him as an opener, where if he takes turn 1, you're going to get a massive 30% combat readiness push to your whole team. 30%, by the way, is no joke. Even the slowest characters on your team, barring speed RNG, are going to be at their worst 50% combat readiness at the start of a game. That means that he's basically doing half the pushing for your team already. So you should be able to very easily overtake an opponent's entire team with almost your entire team at the start of a fight if you have turn 1 with Desert Jewel Basar, or even turn 2 with him and use Bastet Roar. Again, really versatile skill because it's a cleanse. It can be used as protection to ward off stuff that might potentially be incoming in a couple of turns. It can be used as a way to be very, very aggressive. It can be a way to obviously cut in front of things and use, say, like an S3 from Fallen Cecilia to save your team in a clutch scenario. Really, really good move, like I said. Not going to be a better cleanser than Hand Guy, but he has a lot of versatility still at the end of the day. Desert Jewel Basar's Soulburn makes it so that the multipliers on Desert Wind are changed from 7.2% of the allies' health to 14.2% of the allies' health, and it also scales off of 36% of Desert Jewel Basar's attack as opposed to 18% of his attack, all at the cost of 20 souls. It functions very similar to the Soulburn on a character like Ruel or Dastina, but I think theirs is a bit better because in the case of a character like Ruel, it's like 35% of Ruel's health, which is a huge chunk because she's usually built with a lot of HP, very, very tanky. This one's a lot harder, I feel like, to hit higher thresholds. I'll put a table up on your screen so you can see exactly how much you can get out of it. I don't think it's as good, again, as those Soulburns, but it's still very much the same way. If your whole team is kind of beaten up and bruised and you have 20 souls, it might be enough for you to sustain and actually win a game. So use your head and decide if it's correct to actually use this Soulburn. When it comes to Mologora priorities, you should be maxing Bastet Roar first, not only for the 1-turn cooldown, but also here the combat readiness. After that, I probably would max the S1 or S2, depending on what you're actually looking for. The stun chance is pretty good on Desert Wind, so if you want to take that to +4, that's super, super useful. After that, you can take Desert Storm to at least +3 for the -1 turn cooldown. If you really, really want that max blind chance, then you probably should also max this skill out. So for those of you who are trying to skimp by with spending the least amount of Mologoras, you can go +4 in S1, +3 in S2, and max out the S3. For everyone else that is trying to min-max the character, you can go to +14, and it's up to you if you want to get that 5th one in Desert Wind. In this video, there's going to be 2 builds I'm going to be talking about for Desert Jewel Basar. The very first one for us to talk about is the opener / counter pick variant of the character. This is seeking to try to leverage the S2 as a counter pick or the S3 for its combat readiness push. If you primarily are only looking to play Desert Jewel Basar as a pocket pick and not really a traditional cleanser or a Soul Weaver, then this is probably going to be the build that you're going to want to be on. For primary sets, we want to be on speed set because we want him to take turns in a timely fashion. We want him to be higher up on the combat readiness bar for sure. Looking at our offsets here, I think resist set is the best, but when you consider how bad the base stats actually are on Desert Jewel Basar, I wouldn't fault you for playing either health set or defense set. Looking at the desired stats, we have 1,573 attack. This is Desert Jewel Basar's base attack, along with an I-90 weapon, as well as I believe, the artifact Eternus, which we'll be talking about on the very next slide. For defense, I have 1200. If you can get more, by all means, go for it. This character really struggles, again, with bulk. He really needs all the help he can get here in the health and defense departments. For health, I've gone with 13k HP. And even then, that doesn't feel super great. So if you can go higher than this, absolutely go higher than this. He just is very, very squishy. I think for a lot of you watching this video, your first attempt at trying to build DaiJouBu Basar, he's probably going to be around 11,000 health. I encourage you to drop some of the other stats, such as speed, which we'll talk about next, in order to get that health total up. It's really, really important, again, that he stays alive and actually gets to his very first turn so that he can do the things that he is there to actually do. For speed, I have 240 or better. Personally, I think 250 is really where you want him to be. You ideally would like him to be 260 if you're playing in the very higher tier brackets. 250 has been fairly comfortable for me because I really, really want that extra effect resistance, and I had to drop some of my speed in order to do that. So 240 or better is, again, ideal, I feel like, for this character. But depending on your level of play, you're probably going to, again, want to shoot for like 250, 255, 260. Critical hit chance and critical hit damage are based because this is not a damage dealer. Effectiveness I have left at 12%, but if you want to leverage the blind, you can sprinkle in a little bit here or there. For effect resistance, I have 170. It gives you a decent shot here to resist characters like Peyra, characters like Conqueror Lilius, maybe some of the really undergeared Angel of Light Angelicas. You might be able to get away with actually resisting them with this level of effect resistance. Ideally, you would like to have 200 or more. Taking a look at the right side gear, the necklace will be HP percentage, but like we talked about in the stats section, flat HP is acceptable because it's only 5 less HP at the end of the day. For the ring, I'm on effect resistance because I want to have the most amount of effect resistance possible in order for him to actually not get restricted by a character like Peyra, and therefore be able to actually do his job at the very start of a fight, or function as a pocket cleanser if I need him and other ones are taken or banned. You could also play HP percentage or flat HP on the ring slot if you don't really care as much about effect resistance. Again, it's going to depend entirely on your usage. If you don't, again, care about ER at all and you just want to make him as fast as possible, and you have a HP percentage ring or a flat HP ring that will actually get you there to a very, very high speed total. I have seen him go as high as 280 speed, foregoing all effect resistance. So if that's something you're interested in, then I give you obviously the alternative here for you to choose it. Boots or speed, because we're trying to take a turn as close to turn 1 as possible in order to get the combat readiness push on our S3 or be able to punish barrier characters with our S2. For the artifact, I have found Eternus to be incredibly valuable, especially since it is a free-to-play option. It gives you a combat readiness push when someone on your team has a debuff at the end of one of your opponent's turns. So therefore, your DaiJouBu Basar can function kind of like a mini designer Lilibet in that case, and you can, again, either cleanse all of the debuffs and CR push your team, or obviously punish barrier characters again with your S2. In the past, Water's Origin has been a very good artifact in general in Soul Weavers, especially DaiJouBu Basar, because he has such a low life total that this is one of the best ways to actually keep him alive and sustain him. Obviously, if he gets one shot, it's not going to help him, but if they're just trying to pot shot him and slowly whittle him down, Water's Origin is a fairly good option. Guardian Ice Crystals is pretty much a improved version of Water's Origin. It is limited, but it does also give you some effect resistance, so that obviously has synergy as well with the character. The last one obviously is Shamadra's Staff, because it is got 20% effect resistance on it, and obviously that synergizes very, very well with the character. It also gives you bonus healing potency, which is very, very strong with a character like DaiJouBu Basar because he has AoE heals on his basic skill. Looking at the per piece average, you want 18% effect resistance per piece, 8% defense, and 10% health, and then 12% speed in order to reach that 240 speed line that we were talking about earlier. The second build that I want to talk about is a counter set build for DaiJouBu Basar. I feel like it's a little bit memey to use in today's meta, especially since they reworked DaiJouBu Basar to be more of a counter pick / cleansing character. But for completeness sake, I did want to include it because It still is a thing. I have friends such as Professor X, who was kind enough to provide some of the footage that you saw earlier in this video, still play it. And I know a couple of people in the Emperor rating as well that sometimes break out a counter set Desert Jewel Basar. So it's not like it's not a viable build. It's just not as popular anymore. But I still do want to highlight it again because on how to play, I try to do everything for completeness sake. Looking at the primary sets, we're going to be on a counter set, obviously, because it is a counter set build. Although, if you wanted to play a much slower, bulkier Desert Jewel Basar, you can use the desired stats here on speed set if you so choose. Offsets are going to be exactly the same for the ones that we talked about in the last section, but I did include hit because sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, you might have a hit set piece with some really bizarre substats on it, maybe high effect resistance, for example, or really good HP. And obviously, a counter set build that has more stun proc chances can leverage that extra effectiveness from a hit set. For the desired stats, we're going to be at 1,573 attack for the same reasons that we talked about in the last section. The defense, you'll notice, is much higher here at 1,500. This gives him quite a bit of survivability and makes him a lot tankier. Ideally, I think the bulk stats that I have here are what I would really like him to be. With that same level of speed that we talked about in the speed set, but it's just not realistic for him to take turns in a timely fashion, I feel like, with those stats at the higher end tier and still meet the effect resistance requirements. For the health, I have 14k or better. Originally, I had this at 15k because that's what I see some of my other friends do, but it's really hard even for me to emulate a health total at that high of a threshold, so I decided to play it safe and go with 14k HP. If you have more health, by all means, absolutely go for it. For speed, I have 195. I have seen 200 or 205 on a counter set. It's again going to depend entirely on your gear. If you can only get like 185, that's probably also fine as well. Critical hit chance and critical hit damage are still base values because we're not a damage dealer. Effectiveness is 12%, but you could go again a bit higher if you want to really leverage that stun chance. Effect resistance is 200 or higher because we are much slower, and therefore there's not really a reason for us to not hit this actual goal of the high effect resistance. This gives us resistance against most things in the game. Obviously, you'll probably still get tagged by really high effectiveness characters that are over like 170 or 180, for example. You think of like the really, really high-end Payros, the really, really high-end Angel of Light and Angelicas, for example. Taking a look at the right side, the necklace is exactly the same as before, as is the ring and the boots. Looking at the artifact, I think Shamandra's staff is significantly better here than Eternus. We're not really going to be able to leverage that CR push as well on this build, but we can absolutely leverage the bonus AoE healing from Shamandra's staff as well as the bonus effect resistance on this build. So yeah, if every time you get a counter, you're going to get a fat AoE heal, and that's really, really good. You could also use Sacred Tree Branch, which is Sharoon's artifact as well, because it will give your team additional combat readiness push for your carries, which I think is really, really nice. And the final two are Water's Origin and Guardian Ice Crystals for the same reasons we talked about in the previous section. Looking at the per piece average, we're going to want to have 24% effect resistance, 17% defense, 15% health, and 8 speed. Ever since his rework, Desert Jewel Basar has gained a really strong niche at punishing barrier characters thanks to the S2 having the Barrier Inversion mechanic. That makes Operator Sigret a natural teammate choice to pair him with, as she is the other character in the cast that is very, very good at punishing barriers. So if you see a hero like, say, Fallen Cecilia on the enemy team, you can pick both of these characters together and feel pretty confident about your draft. Other than that, you want to be pairing Desert Jewel Basar with either various cleansers that really will help solidify your draft and shore it up against various debuffers. Think of characters like Destina, or even something like maybe a DN for just a generic support with some light debuff removal capabilities. And finally, you really want to be pairing him with characters that can leverage that massive combat readiness push on the S3. Think of a strong single target cleave option like, say, maybe a Luna, or even a character like Edda, who really wants to have a lot of non-attack skill users on her actual team. Both of these kinds of characters are heavily enabled by the massive combat readiness push from Bastet Roar, which should hopefully translate into some really easy game wins. Let's talk about good matchups for Desert Jewel Basar. It should be obvious from everything in this video that Pera and Fallen Cecilia are going to be the best matchups for this character. Do keep in mind, though, that a lot of opponents will try to draft them later in the draft. And if you haven't drafted a lot of carries or a lot of damage at this point, you might be stuck with a very low damage team. Yes, you'll get the Desert Jewel Basar, but they'll be able to play around it because there's no actual threats on your team. So just because they've taken these characters, you actually have to use your head a little bit and think about it. Can you actually win the game with Desert Jewel Basar? If they've taken the characters very, very early, then it's a pretty surefire slam dunk way for you to know, I'm probably taking Desert Jewel Basar. But say last pick Desert Jewel Basar when you haven't taken too many carries, that could be problematic. So again, just really wanted to highlight that and make sure you're aware of that. Other than that, Hua-Young and Arya are other good matchups as well. Hua-Young pretty much always has a barrier at the end of each of her turns, so she's pretty much just an extra turn for free whenever your Desert Jewel Basar comes around and has his S2 available. Arya is a character that gives stealth and a barrier on her S3, and I've caught a lot of people sleeping in the past and not realize that the S3 gives a barrier, and therefore I can invert it and do quite a bit of damage to their entire team. Other than that, Desert Jewel Basar's S3, Bastet Roar, was originally a cleanse, so you want to be pairing him with other cleansers, obviously against various different debuffers, say things like the Tenebrias, for example. He is still supposed to be a cleanser, remember, at the end of the day, not just necessarily a niche character versus barriers. And finally, to round out the video, let's talk about some bad matchups for our boy DaiJouBu. The most obvious of which should be characters that punish non-attack skills. Desert Jewel Basar has 2 non-attack skills in his kit, so characters like Politis, Selene, and Teiyu, should he ever actually receive a buff and become meta relevant, are things to watch out for. The combat readiness push from Bastet Roar will be severely reduced by Politis, and you might end up in a scenario where you take a ton of damage and get cleaved by one. Or if you're versing somebody like Selene, her S2 Blink can take out a key member or carrier of your team, which is problematic if you're trying to play that single target burst comp with a character like, say, Luna, like we highlighted in the teammates section. Other than that, Desert Jewel Basar is a very squishy Soul Weaver compared to many of his other counterparts, which means he's super susceptible to a lot of single target burst. Think of characters like Green Sid, Apocalypse Ravi, or Spectre Tenebria. Green Sid is a speed imprint that is commonly paired with fast characters like Para, so they might be able to counterpick your Desert Jewel Basar with a Green Sid, take the turn before you actually get Desert Jewel Basar's first turn, and kill him immediately with his S3. Apocalypse Ravi is another one that is commonly taken by players that are trying to play a very fast, aggressive comp because they don't really want to play against it. You can use your S2 and kill Para when she has her gigantic shield up, and then use S3 for obviously the big combat readiness push. But if Apocalypse Ravi is still alive, her S3 has a very, very good chance of killing Desert Jewel Basar in one hit, especially if you're on that faster, squishier build, which could then revive Para, and you're just in for a world of hurt and a bunch of bad times at that point. And then Spectre Tenebria is the last one that I want to talk about here. Recently, a lot of people have been playing her on Penetration Set for the S1 Soulburn into S3 combo for big single target burst. That obviously is going to end up being very problematic for Desert Jewel Basar as well, because it has a very high chance of killing him in one hit. So please keep that in mind. And that is going to do it for how to play DJ Basar. Hopefully this was of some help to you. Let me know down in the comments below if there's anything I missed, but more importantly than that, let me know what other characters you want to see on how to play. I originally was not going to do a Desert Jewel Basar video because I didn't think that anybody would want it, or it wasn't going to be very, very helpful, but a number of you had actually let me know via Discord as well as the comment section that you were hoping to see one of these because you had just pulled them. And that is really helpful to me and lets me, know what can help you guys further in the future. If you want to see more guides in this same style, please check out the playlist on your screen now. And as always, have a great day, enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you all later. Bye-bye now.